Okay, we're on the air.
Hey, we are live. Okay,
Live on the wire. Yeah.
on the wire. That's right. This is episode 7 we'll be talking about of season 1 of The Wire. It's called One Arrest, right? And there's a bit to talk about. I want to talk about the first part because I have this thing about the beginnings.
Yeah.
And I love this one, and I want to talk about it a little bit because I think it's kind of a good model for what we see a lot in The Wire. And the kind of watching it through this series, and I'm just sending out a tweet that we're live. Um, but watching this series this time, it's my third time going through it. One of the things that's really interesting about the beginning of this episode is you got Freeman and Prez explaining to Griggs, McNulty, Carver, Hurt, about basically how they're listening, how they're reading, right? We talked about this before when Freeman was training Prez on how to think and read the wire and listen closely and discriminate what's possibly uh, pertinent and what's not. So we talked about that.
Yeah.
Well, in this beginning, it's all about the act of reading and listening closely, as Presbyterian talks about when he talks about the Rolling Stone. You never even heard those lyrics until you've listened to them again and again and again. And I wonder if what we're hearing in this first part is a case not only for watching and listening and kind of paying close attention, but for taking the time to go through this series possibly more than once, because I'm finding there's so much I've missed on my second and third times. And it just was remarkable how potentially self-reflexive this opening scene is about the act of watching, about the act of listening closely. Kind of, again, the show helping you and training you on how to watch it, on how to read it. And this isn't at all novel anymore. I mean, novels have been doing this for a long time, but games do this seamlessly. I mean, it's part of what we understand as the art of video games emerges with the game seamlessly showing you how to play it, how to kind of interact with it. And it's not unique to video games, right? Movies, uh, novels, short stories, all sorts of narrative do this all the time. And it's interesting how The Wire, and you might even say a little bit pedantically, but unless you're looking for it, you don't really see it. It's kind of showing you how to listen, showing you how to watch, showing you how to think about how people speak, right? Like they're breaking
Yeah.
down that, showing you how to break codes. It's a really interesting moment of the show showing you how to watch it. You know, if that makes any sense to
Yeah. Yeah. So I took this one shot of part of the opening scene. This is something that came through the pager, and they look at it, and it's just a string of numbers, and then they're like, turn it upside down. Um,
you. Yeah.
and it's still almost gibberish, but you've got 4 marks. LO for the low rise is 12 for noon. S for stinkum, I think. And that's the code that's in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, as I
Absolutely.
wrote in the blog, I like that because that shows up just before the beginning, and then you've got the epigraph. A man must have a code.
Yeah.
Um,
I really like that. I mean, the epigraph, obviously, it's when Omar and Bunk are talking later on, but the idea of the epigraph being not only about a code or a principle or a standard or some sort of ethos, but also actually a code, like a code to unscramble and to figure out. It's a really nice play on it, and
yeah,
the idea of they're encoding so much of what they do through the phone and through that kind of dated technology again is pretty cool, as if they're speaking through the pager in what we might understand as leet speak, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah.
interesting.
Um, yeah, and then there's like that subliminal message that goes in it as well. That every little detail in this series could potentially mean something more.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's interesting how I read Freeman, and Freeman's obviously often in a position of, as natural police, showing the other police officers, and you see a light going off in their head, and there's a certain thing about kind of, sharing or educating, the other police officers around them or training them, so to speak. And it's hard to get away from that in those scenes. And there's a number of them like them in the series where they're kind of, again, training you on the police work and they have to do some exposition. So it might be just exposition, some could argue, that they have to communicate certain things to you. But I'm actually thinking it goes beyond that, right? It's a reminder that you have to read this closely. Everything's encoded with more meaning. And I love that, and obviously I think it's an interesting take on what might be considered yet another cop show.
Yeah. All the pieces matter.
Yeah. Those epigraphs are interesting.
Yeah. It comes back again and again. Yeah.
Now, speaking of coming back again and again, I want to share a quick shot of one that I think is interesting. I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen and then I'm going to open it. So we've seen this shot before, and you have it here, and I'm going to try and go full shoot. We've seen this statue. This is a statue in the towers. Do you see what I'm looking at, Paul?
Yeah.
And we've seen it before, and we talked about this kind of artwork in the middle of the towers, and you'll notice behind you have, the refrigerator and the chair in the background, and McNulty and Bunk. So it's interesting how it positions you. And, one of the things you got to realize is we saw this before when they were investigating Gant's murder, which was in episode 1. Now, we talked previously how, HBO wanted them to do the flashback. And that's how they dealt with kind of situating the audience. Well, here we're in another situation where this is not, 30 minutes later in another episode. This is 6 episodes later. And they are faced with the question of how to communicate what happened. Well, the statue is the first clue, right?
Yeah.
The picture is another one, which is not a flashback and not nearly as forced, but it's a yet another visual cue to bring your audience back into the moment where they're going to be talking about the Gant murder and not actually have to, force feed it. Now, the Gant murder plays a huge role in this episode, right, because we see Bird get arrested towards the end, and that's a kind of interesting scene in and of itself. But it's interesting. I was thinking about those ideas of codes and visual cues in the actual formation of the narrative, and especially when you're having to connect an episode from day 1, episode 1, to one that's 6 episodes later, and there's a lot that's happened between them. So it's interesting how they're using these visual cues to keep you in mind.
Yeah, that statue there is like a really, powerful, striking image. So if you've been watching it all along, it's something you're probably going to recognize from an earlier episode, and then you see the photograph again, and it all ties together.
Yeah, and there's that visual grammar of this series that, like we've said again and again, the text and the writing is so powerful that oftentimes you can stop there or rely entirely on that. But there's so much going on between the audio, the visual, and the design, set design, that constantly keep in mind. I've been trained by you, so to speak, Paul, because you've been doing all those awesome links to the audio. And a really good audio clip that I would pull out is the one when the runner has the drugs and is running around, and it actually turns out to be the kid who was half blinded by Przybylowski. But when you hear the background when they're chasing him, like, you guys wouldn't do this in a white neighborhood. Like, there is this background, if you listen closely, again, back to that beginning of listening closely, there's so many layers of kind of discussion and of subtext and of tension that exist within, you would imagine within the projects or within our culture more broadly. And they're layered in there so deeply. It's beautiful.
You sort of got not like a play-by-play. It was sort of like a coach yelling, what to do, like, go this way, that way. And someone else is running out what the other guy is doing. And, the way they're explaining everything through the voices and the towers.
Yeah. And as if the tower is kind of, when you get in those scenes, particularly when that kid was half blinded, there's like a chorus and a choir in the background, right? And it can be a menacing choir depending upon, the situation, or it can be a kind of, helpful one depending on the situation. But there's these kind of, this faceless voices that are out
Yeah.
there, instructing.
It's sort of like the environment has a life of its own there.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Um, so speaking of those shots that set the scene, here's another one, and I see these come up all the time as they're transitioning from one scene to something that's in the police building. They show these exterior shots, and that just lets quick visual cue. Okay, we're going to the police building, and maybe it'll be in that insurance office building, or maybe it'll be in the wood paneled office where the upper brass works. But I love all these shots. The visual design aspect of it. You've got the lines, and the color. Um, it really makes kind of an abstract artwork in itself there.
Yeah, and I do. And actually, funny enough, that was one of the shots that I had too. I had kind of saved that shot, and one of the things you realize when you look at that shot is it kind of reinforces those reflective glasses, right? Like,
Yeah,
kind of that was joked around with cops. Like, if they come up to you and they got those reflective glasses, that position of authority, that you don't know where they're looking, or how they're looking. And I think that's a sign of, like, you cut always or often from the projects, right? From a very kind of upfront, kids on the couch, everything's exposed. What's happening is all out, to be kind of to be watched and surveyed. And then you get to these buildings, right? And these buildings, at least when you see them in those transitions, they cut you off, and there's nothing to see. And there's a building in the background that has those thin, kind of like turret-like windows, right? Like,
yeah,
all you can fit through it is like maybe a face and a gun. And so there's these interesting, almost 70s designs, although the reflective windows might be later, of those big institutional imposing buildings. Um,
yeah,
it's interesting the way the architecture and design often reinforces the dynamics in the show.
yeah. Um, we also had that scene at the party. Um,
Like the big wig party that Daniels and his wife go
yeah,
to.
yeah, yeah. Let's see if I can bring this one up. There was a lot of things going on there, but one,
There is.
I made the GIF of that thing where they're doing that like handshake snap thing.
And that
Um,
Daniels knows it.
yeah, yeah, like they both know it. And that sort of fascinated me. That there's, I guess, an understanding between the two characters, even though they're sort of like from different strata. You
Yeah,
know.
absolutely.
Um, although I don't know. I mean, Day Day runs with the senator. So I'm
Yeah,
wondering he's got a leg up on Daniels.
yeah, he does, and that comes back, soon. You start to see that, in episodes that are to follow. But another thing that's interesting about that scene, is the kind of mistaking Daniels to be a driver, right? Like, how quickly he becomes part of his world, and how much he gives him so quickly. That driver, right? Tells him
Yeah,
about his scams, gives away a lot, and immediately, like, he's shocked when he learns that Daniels is a lieutenant. But there's this interesting also mistaking, right? The profiling between the chauffeur and Daniels that's happening so quickly. And it's interesting, I hadn't thought about it, that shake snap is something that, I don't know, like, what does that establish, right? Like, is there a whole kind of, um, code that we're missing? You know what I mean? Like, what code is that?
there could be. Yeah. Um, and he's like mistaking it. Day Day is mistaking Daniels for a chauffeur. Um, but on the flip side, I think he's seeing something too, because Daniels doesn't really fit in with that crowd.
No.
He's there for his wife, who's part of something else. You know?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
and it's interesting that Daniels goes back there too.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, presumably for the Baltimore Orioles game, right?
right.
So it's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I saved the audio clip from that too, which I can't really do, but um, there's something you hear in there, like they're having that conversation, like what are you doing here, that kind of thing, and then you hear that laugh in the background, um, you know, really distinctive from the Clay Davis character before we even see him,
That's right.
and as the series goes on in later season, he becomes a much more important character.
Yeah.
It's like the way he's introduced there is like I like the way that worked. Yeah.
Well, there's actually, I mean, there's an interesting play in this episode between the notion of um, Jimmy potentially being basically, what did we say? They're gonna. He uses a particular term, but he's basically Rawls is trying to frame him, trying to get
Yeah,
him
they're
off.
gonna do him. Yeah.
Yeah, they're gonna do him right. So Rawls is setting up with Santangelo that they're gonna sack Jimmy, right? And Santangelo is his mole, right? That's his turncoat. And there's this interesting kind of, I don't know what to do with it entirely, but you have Jay Landsman who's playing the game on him by sending him to the kind of soothsayer, right? To the kind of psychic. And this notion that Santangelo actually believes it. And at some point Landsman himself is flustered because obviously it's Jimmy and Bunk, thanks to Omar, that solved the case. But there's this kind of weird sense, and I don't even know if I'm going to be communicating it well, but there's this weird sense that happens to some degree, but not often in this series, of this kind of, of this other medium, right? Like the medium where you bury the statue and you go out, and it's a ridiculous idea, but for a second you think Santangelo believes it. And there's a moment
Yeah.
in the series where you're not entirely sure, not to say that obviously the psychic worked, or that the joke that was being played actually backfired, and Landsman didn't know how to react from the fact that he solved it, even though that it was Jimmy. I just found it interesting in this episode in particular how there's comic relief, and that was part of the comic relief, but I'm wondering if something underneath that comic relief is also about the science of police work, and so much that's put on the statistics and the numbers and the clearance rate has also playing with some idea of community and faith and an idea of connection that Santangelo and Jimmy have lost in this relationship that kind of moves away from any clear-cut, logical, scientific reasoning behind the solving. It just seemed like a play, and I don't know if that's what they were going for, but it's a play that for me underscores just how kind of cut and dried and completely divorced and alienated the process for solving these murders, the way of thinking about them. You know what I mean? I don't know. I'm not making myself very clear, but I'm very interested in this notion of this fantastical episode with the gypsy, even though I haven't fully formed a reading of what's going on there. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a couple of things with that. It's like a game, I guess, that Landsman was playing on Santangelo, and Santangelo doesn't understand the game, and it's sort of showing through, even in his police work, I guess. Um, like he doesn't really understand the game that he's supposed to be playing on McNulty
Yeah.
until Rawls set him straight there. Um, and that's it. That's shift from like scientific to supernatural. That's interesting. You bring that up because I was talking to a faculty member who's teaching a course on detective fiction
Yeah.
this series, and he's going from Sherlock Holmes, Hound of the Baskervilles to Nevada Bar. Is the name? Some author title I don't even know. But basically, it's a shift from Sherlock Holmes, scientific crime detection to Raymond Chandler, society's corrupt, man can't do anything about it, to the sort of like, modern day or postmodern detective type fiction where it's got that supernatural element, like the Ghost Whisperer or whatever,
Absolutely.
um, where crime goes from something that's pure science to something that's beyond human ken.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, and I definitely, I'm not trying to suggest that that's the way police work needs to be done versus the statistical,
Yeah,
but it's interesting that they're almost, paying homage to another part of the kind of paranormal, right, where you bring these psychics in. And I know with the serial killer in Washington, the Green River killing, the killer, I think his name, I think the reference was, they spent a ton of time bringing in psychics, and because for 20 years they couldn't figure out anything, right? They had no lead, and what does Santangelo says on his own case when it starts? It's completely dead. It's completely cold, and that's why they were able to play like this. But you know, I'm fascinated by this notion of the supernatural in the series because it's not something that comes up really very often, and I think you could argue season 5 starts to go off the rails a little bit with this, but it's just an interesting side note about this episode.
yeah, yeah. Um, I had another scene from that party that I liked. This is an image of Daniels, and it's something going through a lot of the series that the acting, so much of it is like in the eyes, the expression, little gestures, little things tell the whole story here. And he does this time and again, this like little backward side eye glance at people. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
and it's just like so perfect. Like
Yeah, there was the one with Bunk when he was looking at Jay after Jay was giving him a hard time, and he picks up the gun and then looks that way. Like there's these
yeah,
small gestures.
yeah, and it's like a split second.
Absolutely. Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah,
All right. Um, so you have the animated GIFs when you're talking. You have Orlando and Dee, and you have Herc and Carver, and they're both giving each other the kind of handshake. And it was
yeah,
interesting, this notion of parallels that you're kind of looking at in this episode. But parallels, the series of parallels that we've talked about a bunch, and there's a good example of it. You got Herc and Carver on the left,
yeah, yeah,
and then Orlando and Dee doing the same thing.
yeah.
And then you have the shake snap down below. And it's interesting how all of these happen between, in some ways, one at a fancy party, one in the pit, and one in the police department. And I'm wondering what you think about these parallels based upon the different contexts in which they happen.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I mean, the one parallel I'm looking at, you've got the two police and then the two people in the Barksdale crew. They're on like opposite sides of the fence, but they've got this same physical lingo going on between them. Um, and, it comes out totally natural. Like, so is that just, the way people do things, or is it signifying, that they're on the same level in certain ways, or
Or
other
there's not
sides
such
of the
a great
coin?
gulf between them, right?
Yeah,
Like it's not,
yeah,
they're not that different in some ways.
yeah, yeah. And the one between Daniels and Data, that's a little different, but it's showing an understanding between the two of them, and maybe also that they don't quite belong where they are.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right. I mean,
um,
in different ways too, right? I mean, you can think of
yeah,
the notion of that's constantly underscoring this series is this notion of the serving and who do we serve, like who's watching us, and Daniels quickly associates himself with a civil public servant. He goes back to where the people who are the kind of limousine drivers, etc., are hanging out. And this notion of kind of breaking up, particularly at a high class party like that one, people into those who, are served and those who, do serve. And then outside of that, you have a kind of complete, gutted, people who have nothing, right? Who are kind of on the outside of it. One of the quotes I came across this week, and it was a kind of throwaway quote, but it's a great post that it's a great kind of link I found online that I'm gonna write about at some point, which points to the kind of the production of The Wire in Baltimore and some of the kind of particular situations. Like they talk at length about why they shot it in 4:3, not in widescreen. Why keep it that traditional, television stuff, right? It's interesting. Like
the
a lot of
interview
those,
with Joe Chappelle, is that it?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah,
It's
that's
cool,
a good
right?
one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Well, one of the images that came up, and one of the quotes that I found remarkable, and it made me think about it when we talk about the serving and servants, is this idea of, The Wire is for the most part about people we fear becoming poor, powerless, addicted, and dead-ended. And I heard David Simon talk about, The Wire and his idea of The Wire, and based on his reporting and his journalism. And he said, really The Wire comes out of a reality we find ourselves in post-industrial U.S., particularly in the city, right? You have a whole community and a whole kind of a group of folks who haven't been trained for anything but these kind of industrial or service jobs, and they're gone, right? And so you have a whole community of people, right? A whole class of people who don't have, the ability to understand themselves through anything else but their work, and they have no work. And he says everybody really understands themselves through their work, pretty much. That's a crucial part of our identity. And what was interesting, too, based on that, is I was reading Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's reaction to Ferguson and to what happened. And he was talking about how obviously important race is, but equally important that often doesn't get discussed is the growing underclass and the growing, division of wealth right now in the U.S. and what that means for further kind of, enforcing this militarized presence in our cities and in our townships. And it was just interesting. I mean, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is someone who I have a particular affinity for. He went to UCLA. I find him a fascinating historical figure, but also, his underscoring so much what I think The Wire underscores is race is huge. It's essential to thinking about how this narrative talks about. But on top of that, one of the narratives that Americans often have a hard time coming to terms with is how deeply, situated questions of class are, right? And questions of, the disenfranchising of an entire community of workers that will really come into sharp focus in season 2 when we shift away from the cops and we move to the dock workers, right? Or what were the dock workers? And so it's a really interesting kind of moment when you start thinking about servants and the relationships between, say, the cops and the drug dealers and Day-Day and Daniels. What you have in the back of all of these are relationships around work, are relationships around class, are relationships between power that I think they make a very pointed attempt to cross between, not so strictly dividing it between the drug dealers in the pit and the cops, right? It's completely blurred, between the culture, between the way in which they shake, even between the language.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting kind of frame.
Yeah, because you go back to those 2 gifts with Herc and Carver and Orlando and Dee. They're all, at that like blue collar level, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, and Kirk is joking like he understands the language, right?
Which is less than middle class nowadays, almost.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that kind of, the idea of being a servant, the idea of being a public servant, and not that that's a bad thing by any means, is interesting that Daniel should choose to hang with Day-Day and have that kind of back and forth. And then at the end of it, they're still in tension for various reasons based on their particular modes of servitude and who they serve. But there's just an interesting, for me, a moment there that tries to distinguish between easy, stark ideas of good and bad or black and white or even questions of race. It's never so stark in this series, right? It's always these, wide varieties of different people. And it's funny, it comes out more than anyone when Bird, for example, is being interrogated and he calls McNulty, you uptown, up-class white boy. And it's like, McNulty might be the lowest class of them all.
Uptown white whore, I think he calls
Uptown white whore, that's right.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I mean, that's another thing you see in this series, and it's going to be reinforced, again and again. But that's one of the real kind of nuances I love about this show is the way in which it pushes you to kind of negotiate questions beyond race, but not excluding race or discounting race, and that usually comes up.
Yeah, that idea of class, I mean, they're small and dark, so it's hard to see those pictures here. But the one on the right is the party where Daniels is at, which is a political fundraiser for, the high and mighty of Baltimore or Maryland, I'm not sure. And the scene next to it is actually going on simultaneously. During the show, they cut from one to the other. And, it's this little dive bar crowded in between some other things, on a street full of parking meters. The other place has this, wide expanse, open driveway, probably valet parking. It's showing really two different worlds that the people are in there.
Yeah.
And then when you get to the interior of the bar, it's, dark and dank and the garish red glow on the wall, sets an entirely different character for the two different worlds these people inhabit.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, and I do think that's a real frame for The Wire more broadly as a conceptual piece about America. So, all right. Well, tomorrow we'll try and do another one for episode 8 around this time. Say around 5 or 5:15. Does that work? I have an appointment at 6, but I think 5 or 5:15 would work for me if that works.
Yeah, we could roll with that.
Okay. Awesome.
All right.
Until episode 8.
All right. Till next time.
Bye-bye.